Okay, so kind of heavy topic today, but we're diving into juvenile homicide.
Yeah.
It's something that I think, we see in the headlines, and it's easy to kind of just let those stories wash over you. But we really wanted to take a deep dive into, like, what are the factors that contribute? What's really going on here? And luckily, we have the Routledge International Handbook of Juvenile Homicide to guide us.
It's an excellent book, very thorough, covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, and it's not just about, like, the nitty-gritty of the crimes themselves. It's about, like, the psychology, the sociology, the history. I mean, it really kind of paints a full picture.
It does. And, thankfully, one of the first things that it talks about is that there have been declining rates since the mid-90s.
That's good, right.
It is good. Yeah, it's very good.
But it's not, like, solved or anything.
No, not at all. Like you said, still in the headlines, and it's still a very important issue that we need to address. We need to figure out, how to make those numbers even lower. But I think one of the things that really stood out to me is that it's not just about the overall numbers going down, but like who's still being left behind.
Right, because even if the rates are declining overall, there are certain demographics that are still disproportionately affected.
Exactly.
That's a huge problem.
And the book talks about, for example, black males aged 15 to 17. They're still, unfortunately, overrepresented in these cases.
Yeah.
And so that really makes us kind of think about those broader societal issues of, poverty, lack of opportunity.
Systemic racism,
absolutely.
All those things that we know play a role.
Right. And it's important to emphasize that, understanding those factors doesn't excuse the behavior at all, but it helps us see the full context,
Totally. It's about recognizing those underlying tensions and trying to address them. So I guess it's not as simple as just looking at the crime itself. We have to consider the whole ecosystem.
Yes. And speaking of context, one of the things that I found really interesting was the book's point about the victim-offender relationship.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that, because I was surprised by this.
Yeah, because, when we think about homicide in general, we often think about, domestic violence cases.
Mm-hmm.
But with juveniles, it's a little bit different. It's more often acquaintances or even strangers.
Yeah.
And that suggests that those everyday conflicts, arguments, perceived disrespect, those things can escalate really quickly, sometimes with really tragic consequences.
And I'm guessing that, sadly, access to firearms plays a role in how quickly those situations escalate.
Absolutely. The book is very clear about that. Firearms are the predominant weapon used in these crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so any solution to this problem really needs to address that issue of weapon accessibility.
Right. It's almost like a tragic puzzle where each piece, the societal pressures, the impulsivity of youth, access to weapons, they all contribute to that bigger picture.
It's complex.
Yeah, it is. And it's not just a U.S. problem either, is it?
No, it's global.
The book talks about how other countries are dealing with this too.
It does. And it's interesting to see how different cultures approach it. They were talking about how in Canada, they really emphasize rehabilitation and community reintegration.
Okay.
Whereas in Australia, there's a big focus on understand this thing called co-offending, which is where juveniles commit homicide in groups. They're statistically more likely to do that in Australia.
Oh, wow. So we're starting to get a sense of this global landscape, but what about the individual level? Like, what is actually going on in the lives of these young people that leads them down this path? The book talks about risk factors, right?
Right, and I think it's important to say right off the bat that, there's no single cause for this. Every single case is different. There's so many different factors at play, but there are some common threads that emerge. And the book talks about, things like the history of childhood abuse or neglect.
Right, and we see that in one of the book's most heartbreaking case studies.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Peter Jones, he endured years of horrific abuse from his father. It's just a stark reminder of how deeply those early experiences can scar a child.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to have those support systems in place, early intervention for families who are struggling.
Yeah.
Because those early experiences can be so formative. Now, we always have to be careful about correlation versus causation.
Of course, yeah.
Not every child who experiences abuse is going to become violent.
Right.
But
yeah,
it is a significant risk factor that can make a young person more vulnerable to making those destructive choices later on.
It's about understanding that vulnerability, right? Those cracks in the foundation that can sometimes lead to these negative outcomes.
Right. And it's not just about external factors either.
Right, because the book also talks about brain dysfunction, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we can't forget about the biological and developmental aspects of this. So the book was explaining that the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for impulse control
Right.
and rational decision making, it's not fully developed until our mid-20s.
Oh, wow.
So teenagers, even those who are, 18, 19, they literally have a harder time hitting the brakes in those really emotionally charged situations.
Interesting. So you're saying their brains are literally still developing?
Developing,
So
yeah.
they're more prone to act impulsively.
Exactly.
And then you layer on top of that things like, a history of delinquency, gang involvement, easy access to weapons, exposure to violence.
Right, it can be a recipe for disaster.
It's like a perfect storm of risk factors.
It is, and the book talks about Carla.
Yeah, that was a really tough story.
Her story is a perfect example of how all of those things can just come together.
It's like her history of being mistreated made it even harder for her to make good choices in really, really intense, heated moments.
Exactly, yeah. It's heartbreaking, but it's important to remember that none of these factors alone determine someone's future.
Right, of course, of course.
Right, and the book does a good job of reminding us that even in these very dark situations, there's always hope.
There's always hope for change, for rehabilitation.
Exactly.
And that's a good thing because some of these stories are really heavy.
Yeah, they are. But, speaking of those stories, I think it's important to delve into some of the individual cases.
Yeah, let's do it.
The book highlights that really give a face to these statistics. So yeah, I mean, it's easy to get lost in all the statistics and the research, right?
Right.
But what really struck me about this book is how they never lose sight of the human element.
Right.
Like, these aren't just case numbers, these are real people.
Yeah, with families, with stories.
Exactly. And they have the potential for change. Like, they really highlight that.
Yeah, and one of the stories that really stuck with me was Malcolm.
Oh, yeah, tell me about him.
So he's a juvenile serving a life sentence for a crime he committed when he was like a teenager.
Right.
And it would have been so easy for him to just kind of give up, right?
Oh, right.
But he didn't. He's dedicated like decades of his life to therapy, to self-reflection. He's really trying to like make amends and better himself.
It's amazing. It really gives you hope, that people can change, that rehabilitation is possible.
Yeah.
Even, within the prison system.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that we shouldn't give up on people.
Exactly.
That there's always that potential for growth and redemption.
Absolutely.
So the book also delves into cases where there were multiple people involved.
Right. Co-offending.
Yeah, and it seems like that adds like a whole other layer of complexity.
It does, because the dynamics are different when you have a group of people involved.
Oh, right.
And one of the things they talked about was that when juveniles commit homicide in groups, they're statistically more likely to kill strangers.
Oh, interesting. So it's not necessarily about like personal vendettas or anything like that.
Right. It might be less about those interpersonal conflicts and more about, other criminal activities. Like, the book talks about how a lot of these group homicides are linked to robberies gone wrong or gang violence.
Okay, so it's like that group mentality can sometimes escalate things in a really dangerous way.
Yeah, and also juveniles who offend in groups tend to have like prior offenses on their record. So we're talking about, a pattern of behavior.
Right, so there's often a history there that we need to be aware of. Okay, so we're talking about a lot of really heavy stuff here, a lot of like really complex factors that contribute to this issue.
We are.
But the book doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair, does it?
No, not at all.
There's a whole section on solutions and interventions.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say. They actually go into a lot of depth about different approaches that have shown real promise.
Okay, so spill the tea. What are some of the strategies that stand out?
Well, one of the big ones is intensive therapeutic interventions.
Okay. And we're not just talking about like your typical therapy session here, right?
Yeah.
This is like really specialized stuff.
Exactly, yeah. We're talking about programs that are specifically designed for young offenders.
Got it.
And the book talks about this one called the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center.
Okay.
Have you heard of that?
I think so. It's not your average juvie detention center.
No, not at all. So they use this thing called multisystemic therapy,
Okay.
or MST.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, it's about addressing the young person's entire ecosystem.
Interesting.
So their family, their peers, their school environment, it's all connected.
It's about seeing the whole picture, not just the individual in isolation.
Exactly. And they work on things like, building positive communication skills, developing healthy coping mechanisms, addressing any underlying trauma.
So it's like a very holistic approach.
Very holistic.
Okay. But I'm guessing these programs, they require a pretty serious commitment, right? Like, it's not a quick fix.
No, absolutely. This is a long-term commitment.
Yeah.
And that's where that idea of treatment dosage comes in. Remember we were talking about that earlier?
Yeah, yeah. So the longer and more intense the intervention, the more effective it's going to be.
Exactly. The data really supports that. It's like, imagine you're trying to heal a broken bone. You wouldn't just put a Band-Aid on it and call it a day, right?
Right.
You need a cast, you need physical therapy.
Yeah.
You need to consistently work at it over time for it to heal properly. And it's kind of the same thing with these interventions.
It's a good analogy. It makes a lot of sense. So intensive therapy is one piece of the puzzle.
It is.
What else? What else does the book talk about?
Well, they also talk about these character development programs.
Okay.
And the idea here is to equip young people with the tools they need to make good choices.
Okay.
So things like empathy, anger management, conflict resolution, these are all skills that can be learned.
So less about punishment and more about empowerment.
Exactly. It's about giving them the tools to create a better future for themselves. And they highlight some specific programs like EQIP.
Okay.
And the Primed framework.
I see. And those have been shown to be effective.
Yeah, they have. Not necessarily as dramatically as some of those really intensive therapy programs.
Right.
But the research does suggest that they can make a difference, especially for lower risk offenders.
Okay, so it's about finding the right level of intervention based on the individual's needs and risk factors.
Exactly.
Got it. So that makes sense. But with all these different interventions and programs out there, how do we know which one is going to be the most effective for a given individual? How do you even begin to navigate that?
That's such a good question. And
Yep.
the book talks about this this model, the R&R model.
R&R, okay.
Yeah, it stands for risk, need, responsivity.
Okay.
So basically, you're assessing the individual's risk factors.
Oh, okay.
Their history of delinquency, substance abuse, exposure to violence.
Got it.
And then you're identifying their specific needs, do they need help with anger management?
Okay.
Do they need substance abuse treatment?
Makes sense.
Family therapy, whatever it might be.
So it's about creating a personalized plan.
Exactly. And then the responsivity part is about, taking into account their learning style,
Right.
their motivation level, their cultural background, and making sure that the intervention is actually going to resonate with them.
So it's not just about what you do, it's about how you do it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. But I also have to ask, all these solutions, they sound great in theory, but do they actually work?
I know, right? That's the big question.
Yeah, what does the book say about their effectiveness in the real world?
Well, the good news is that the book actually delves into the research on that.
Okay, good.
They talk about recidivism rates. They talk about the long-term impact of these interventions. And there's some really interesting data there. But I think we should probably save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, come on, you're killing me. All right, fine, you're off the hook for now. But next time, you are spilling the tea on those recidivism rates.
I promise. I promise I will.
All right, so last time we were left hanging with this whole idea of recidivism rates, right?
Yes.
These interventions sound great on paper,
Yeah.
but do they actually work in the real world?
Well, and that's the thing, right? You have to look at the data.
Right.
And the book does a really good job of diving into the research on that. And what they found is that, when it comes to these intensive therapy programs, like the Mendota one we were talking about,
Yeah.
the results are actually pretty compelling.
Okay, so spill the tea.
They're good.
Yeah.
When you compare it to traditional juvenile justice approaches,
Okay.
they've shown that they can significantly reduce recidivism rates.
Significant, give me a number. What are we talking about here?
Yeah. So depending on the study, right? Because there's been a bunch of research on this, and it's it varies depending on the program and the specific population and all that. But
Right.
but generally speaking, you're looking at recidivism rates dropping by 30% or even more.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
It is.
And that really underscores that whole treatment dosage thing, right?
Exactly.
The more intensive the intervention, the better the outcomes.
Exactly. It's not a quick fix.
Right.
It's about consistent, dedicated effort over time. It's you were talking about that analogy of the tree, right?
Yeah, you got to nurture it. You got to give it time to grow.
Exactly. You can't just water it once
Right.
and expect it to be this big, beautiful oak tree overnight.
Exactly.
It takes time.
Okay, so these programs, they're not just about keeping these kids from reoffending.
Right.
They're also about, like, actually helping them thrive.
Exactly. Like
Right.
improving mental health,
Mm.
increasing education, even like strengthening family relationships,
Yeah.
which is huge.
It's like, it's not just about damage control. It's about, like, setting them up for a better future
Exactly.
in all areas of life. That's really cool. What about those character development programs?
Oh, yeah.
We talked about those a little bit. Do those have an impact on recidivism?
They do. Yeah, they do. Not as dramatic as the intensive therapy programs.
Okay.
But the research suggests they can still make a difference, especially for, lower risk offenders
Okay.
who might not need like that really deep dive therapy, but they
Yeah.
can still benefit from, having those positive role models, learning those social skills, building that empathy.
So it's kind of like a preventative measure in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like catching them before,
Before they fall too far.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. But even with, like, all this positive data, all these programs, it feels like we're still just, like, scratching the surface of a much bigger problem, right? Like,
Right.
the book even talks about this idea of, like, disappearing juvenile crime waves. What is that all about? That sounds kind of ominous.
Yeah, it's basically like a reminder that these trends, they're not static.
Okay.
Like they're constantly changing. So, they were talking about like back in the 1990s when juvenile crime rates were like skyrocketing in the US.
Everyone was freaking out.
Everyone was terrified. But then almost as quickly as they rose, they plummeted.
Interesting. So what happened there?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
Experts are still like debating the exact causes and, it's probably a combination of factors, but some of the things they talk about are changes in policing strategies,
Okay.
economic shifts. Even like there was a decline in lead exposure during that time, which has been linked to, impulsivity and aggression.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So it's really complex.
So complex.
There's no easy answer.
No, it's not just one thing. But the point is that like we can't just assume that these downward trends are gonna like magically continue forever.
Right. We can't become complacent.
Exactly. We have to stay vigilant. We have to keep, researching, keep funding these programs, keep, advocating for change because
Right, because it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. It's not a problem that's just going to solve itself.
So where do we even begin? Like as individuals, as communities, like how can we actually make a difference?
Well, I think, first and foremost, it's about awareness.
Right.
Like we've been doing today, like educating ourselves and others about the issue, understanding the root causes, the risk factors. And then from there, we can start to advocate for change, right? Support early intervention programs, push for stricter gun control measures, address those, systemic inequalities that we were talking about, promote mental health awareness.
It's about creating a world where kids feel safe and supported
Exactly.
and empowered to make good choices.
Exactly.
It sounds like a lot, but
It is, but
it's worth it
it is.
if we can save even one life.
Absolutely. And, for those who want to like really dive deep into this, like you said, I highly recommend checking out the full book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read, even if it is a little bit heavy at times.
Yeah.
But this deep dive, it's been really eye-opening. It's been thought-provoking, and ultimately, I think, hopeful.
Yes, definitely.
Like it's a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, there's always hope.
Absolutely.
There's always potential for change, for growth, for redemption, and we can't lose sight of that.
We can't. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this journey, this deep dive.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure as always, and to all of our listeners out there, thank you for listening, for engaging with these really important issues, and keep asking those tough questions. Keep fighting for a brighter future for all young people.